Good morning and welcome back to Coworking with Iris. Happy Friday. I hope everybody out there is having a great day. Today I'm talking with Doug Maschoff, who is a great guy and has created a couple of tools that I think the co-working world can use. Today we'll be talking about a market analysis tool that he created. Doug's background is in real estate management, really more property management, and I'll let him tell you a little bit about that. I found this tool intriguing because as co-working operators look to expanding and they look to determine which markets are viable for co-working, there's a lot of factors that go into making that determination. And the tool that Doug has created is the most comprehensive one I've seen so far. And Doug has agreed to at least show it to us and talk about his methodologies behind the tool, which I'm hoping will help other co-working operators who want to expand into different cities to understand the methodologies that they might need. If you're like me, you might not be an analysis type person or a figures type of person, and more of a community people type of person, in which case this information will be really helpful. Good morning, Doug, and welcome.
Yes. And you're not an analysis type of person? That seems...
Well, let's just say I don't have a degree in computer science. So Doug, welcome, and please tell us about yourself. What's your co-working story?
Well, I was in real estate for a little bit over 10 years. I did sales, I did investment, I did development, property management. I had a property management company for 7 years, and a sales brokerage. I ended up selling those about, I don't know, maybe a year and a half or so ago. And I was just trying to figure out what was next. And I was kind of faced with the reality that I had to work from home, which I had done in the past and I wasn't really a big fan of. I didn't really get a lot done. Someone told me about co-working. I went and I checked out a space in Atlanta, and I just fell in love with it. And I kind of said, you know, this is, I don't know what I'm going to do exactly, but this is what I want to do. And I got connected to Jeremy from NextSpace, and started talking to him about helping expand NextSpace, develop new locations, which is something that I'm kind of comfortable with, like analyzing markets and doing site analysis and real estate development and that kind of thing. And so it seemed like a good fit. Long story short, decided to start a software company instead, co-working software. But that's how I got into co-working. That's how I got interested in the industry. So during that process, I learned a lot about the industry, and I, developed, this tool or analysis of different markets, or kind of like method for analyzing different markets. And it's still kind of a work in progress and never really totally completed it. But I think like the methodology behind like how we went about analyzing different markets can still be applied, even if it's kind of tweaked by whoever's using it.
So what factors did you look for, in analysis? I don't come from the real estate world, so I'm sure that there are sort of typical factors that real estate people who think in terms of real estate look for. So what were the key factors that you looked for in this analysis tool that you've created?
Well, I mean, we were trying to forecast demand in certain markets. So, when you're trying to figure out demand with certain types of real estate, it's really pretty easy. Like, we developed self-storage at one point, and self-storage is basically, there's a certain square feet demanded per person, and that's it. It's really easy. But with co-working, it's like certain markets are good for co-working, certain markets aren't. And it's much more based on like the demographics of like who uses co-working, certain age ranges or, um, line of work and stuff like that. So, it's difficult right now, because co-working is such a new industry still. And there's not a lot of data out there. But there's, like Desk Mag and like, what is it? Emergent Research? Is that
Yeah,
one?
Steve and Carolyn of Small Base
Yeah,
Labs. Uh-huh.
yeah, yeah, right. And so, there are various different sources for information, to find out like who it is that's actually using co-working. And so, we kind of put that together, developed kind of different demographic segments that we believed were like a demand for co-working. And then we tried to get data on exactly how much of each was in each market, which was a long process, but that's basically how we went about it.
And I, I think you said something that I want to address, which is that um, there are markets that don't work for co-working. And I think it's important to note that, at least in my worldview of co-working can work in almost any situation. It's really what the intention is behind the space that you want to open and you want to operate. I see co-working working in rural areas, and in those areas they become the community centers and almost the new Grange, as I've mentioned before, of that area. And I see co-working working in urban cores. I think those tend to be the most popular co-working space, or ideas for how to open a co-working space, especially in people looking to get into co-working as a real estate play. And also to note that there's, there are many demographics of co-working. Some places, especially in downtown San Francisco, where I co-work quite often, it's really skews towards the millennial generation, towards startups. Whereas in my home co-working community where I live in Santa Cruz, there are people who are in their 60s, late 60s, many people in the age group that I belong to of the 40s to 60s. That being said, this being an emerging market, I do think that people are looking for, especially if you're looking at co-working as a real estate play, people are looking for a certain demographic guarantee. And in that case, I think this is where a tool like this would be most valuable. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, like for instance, my old business partner, Ramon Gonzalez, he owns, or he opened up Thrive Co-working in Alpharetta, Georgia, which is where I used to work out of before I moved to Denver. And it's a great co-working space. It's very successful, but it's not filled with a bunch of software developers, and it's not filled with a bunch of millennials. It's filled with, like there's CPAs, there's kind of tutors and like, teachers, and there's just, it's a different demographic than what you would find in like San Francisco, for instance. So like, I definitely think that it really just depends on the area. I think co-working can thrive, pun intended, I guess, in any area. And I guess like what we were trying to do is I mean, to like basically say whether an entire market is good for co-working. I mean, that's kind of difficult to do. I mean, really what we were trying to do is identify markets that we wanted to take a closer look at. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're great for co-working or they're not great for co-working, but they have certain factors that kind of would lead us to believe that there's a possibility that there might be pockets within that market that would be good. And so, I mean, once you identify them, if you identify Denver as a great place for co-working, it doesn't mean that you can just go and build a co-working space anywhere. That, after you identify a market that you want to take a closer look at, then you need to go in and do like further market analysis and site analysis and look at, like where are their universities and where are the employment centers and what are the traffic counts and all kinds of things on like a really granular level. But we were just trying to take that first step to finding, where to look.
Yeah. And I think, this tool is really able to help determine the financial viability of those co-working markets and the financial viability if somebody is looking to expand and their goal is profitability in their co-working company, then having a tool like this is going to be really important. How about we dive in? Do you want to show it to us? You want to do some screen sharing?
Sure, let me screen share. Okay. Awesome. Okay. So can you see my screen?
I can see your screen. It's very colorful.
Yes, yes it is. Lots of rows and numbers and all that good stuff. So I guess I'll just kind of give you an overview of how we went about this. On the left, we obviously have different cities. And then on the right, all these columns are different, well, not just demographic segments, but different, data points for each city that we wanted to look at and that we thought would factor into how good a market was for co-working. So like population, obviously, if you have a lot of people, there's probably going to be higher demand for co-working. Not only that, but we wanted to look at markets that were growing and not declining. So population growth, population density. Like in a downtown area, a lot of times co-working, does better. This is one that we never actually got to, which I thought was really interesting. But we found every single Starbucks location in the entire country. And so we were going to figure out the Starbucks per capita for each city that we were analyzing. And so we didn't quite finish it, but I thought that was a pretty interesting way of looking at it, because we kind of figured that, Starbucks isn't really like a competitor to co-working. We kind of figured if we put a co-working space in the middle of a bunch of Starbucks locations, that probably a decent amount of those people would actually use the co-working location.
Sure. And I think, just to speak to that, I do think that for people who are looking for co-working, that has been some of the sort of anecdotal, if you will, metrics and information that people have looked for. How many coffee shops are there, and in those coffee shops, how many people are there on laptops?
Yeah, laptop. We would go to Starbucks in different locations, and we would literally count how many laptops we saw at each one. So yeah, I definitely agree with that. So anyway, other factors, and don't need to get too into all of them, but like, white collar workers, home-based workers, different age ranges, like 22 to 44 was kind of like the age ranges that we identified as more commonly using co-working spaces. Bachelor's degree or higher, marketing, computer worker, journalist, PR, marketing, computer, web, creative workers. I think that's an actual segment. And not only like bachelor's degree or higher white collar workers, but like the percentage of the population, it's kind of like population density. We don't just want a lot of people, we want a dense population, and we want like a high concentration of these different segments that we believed were good for co-working. And so then basically what we did was we said, let's rank let's assign a score to each market. And so, out of 10. And so we said like the city with the highest of each one of these segments, we're going to rank that at 10, and the city with the lowest, we're going to rank that at 0. And so then basically we were able to assign a a score from 0 to 10 for each one. Then what we did was for each segment, we said, let's assign a weight to it. Certain segments are more important in our opinion than others, and that's kind of like an important thing to point out, that this is really just our opinion. And if you make this and then you have these different variables, it allows you to kind of tweak the variables as you gain more data or as you gain more experience and you learn more about like what what is a more important segment to focus on in terms of like demanding co-working. You can kind of modify this as time goes on. And also, like I already said, this was really just a way to guide us in the right direction on like what markets to look at, and to like take a closer look at. So basically, this is like our quantitative analysis on each market. And then we also did a qualitative analysis, which is, I think I mentioned to you, kind of cheating for us. And it's kind of like us being lazy, because we found a bunch of other like lists and articles and stuff, like best cities for tech jobs and top cities for startups. And we said, like, for each city on those lists that we would like kind of give it a value and like a qualitative analysis. And once again, the value would be out of 10. So then what we did was we established a quantitative score and a qualitative score for all these different markets, and we ranked them all out of 10. And whether it's right or wrong, this is kind of what we came up with. So, we could be missing certain demographic segments. We could be assigning weights, not accurately enough, but this is kind of like the methodology that we used. And I mean, the list that we came up with is, I'm pretty sure co-working is pretty successful in all those cities. So I don't know if we were too far off. And then another thing that I did was I took out that qualitative analysis and I just did it based on the data that we found. And then we, come up with kind of like a different list of cities. And once again, and these are probably less well known than the other lists, Austin and, San Francisco, and although San Francisco is number 12 there. But, once again, like, the top two, I can name co-working spaces in those. The third one is 30 minutes from me. I know a number of co-working spaces there. So, once again, it could be Santa Monica isn't necessarily the top place in the whole country to open a co-working space, but I would say, like our thought on this was that, the top 25, probably let's start there in terms of like markets that we're looking at, and let's choose those cities to take a closer look at.
Yeah. And so a question that we talked about earlier before we were on air, I was curious, going back to the other view that you had where Austin was number 1, San Francisco number 2. Those are the obvious, those of us who are in co-working and have been for a while know that those are sort of the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah.
So how do you take into account then, if those are the low-hanging fruit, that everybody's moving to that location? Everybody's opening a co-working space in Austin, Texas, or in San Francisco or in Seattle. So at what point does market, the dreaded word market saturation happen, and how do you determine that?
Right. Yeah. So basically what I just showed you was, it kind of shows demand for each city, but it doesn't really necessarily say how much demand. And like, okay, it has a score of 6.4, but what does that mean? In terms of like how many square feet can I build in this city? And if I build that many square feet, is there already too much co-working in that city? So what we did was, like certain industries, like I'll use self-storage again. It's like there are certain rules of thumb, which, it's like for X amount of people, there's X or Y amount of square feet demanded. The industry knows that because it's a very mature industry. It's based on lots of research, and we don't really have that for coworking. So, we had to kind of say, well, what we did was we said, if there's a market where it is 100% saturated, which really I don't think that exists right now, but we said, San Francisco is probably a more mature market than a lot of other markets in the country. So if we just assume that the amount of demand in San Francisco equals the amount of supply, then we can say, okay, well, let's figure out how much supply there is, which is really just kind of like you just got to do a lot of research. You need to look at, it's like looking up co-working spaces on Google Maps and measuring them and trying to figure out how many square feet, and like looking on websites and trying to figure out like how many members they have and how that translates to square footage and stuff like that, to figure out really how many square feet of co-working space is in the city. And so whether we got everyone or not, I'm sure that, and this is out of date right now, but let's say it's 404,000 square feet. Actually, I'm sorry. Let's see, is that square feet? Yeah. So that's the square feet of co-working that we found. And so then you say like, okay, well, if we add up for this, what I'm showing you right here, all we used was creative workers and home-based workers. But really what you should do is you should take all of the sum of all of these different segments and add them up. And then say for that sum, if that sum of people in San Francisco demands, 404,000 square feet of co-working space, then you can say like how many square feet per person in those segments is demanded. And if you kind of, sorry if I'm dorking out too much on my
okay.
real estate analysis.
I'm geeking out on listening to you. It's pretty fun.
If you say that like, San Francisco is a saturated market, then you can say that for any other market, then you can use that same ratio of like square feet per person in those segments of co-working space demanded. So then as long as you know that number of people in all those different markets, you can say, what's the total square footage demand for each market? And then once you know that, then it's just about finding every single co-working space in every market, which is, obviously a huge task. But I mean, if you're just doing it on a market by market basis, it doesn't take too long to figure it out, or at least, roughly figure it out. So then like based on that, you can say, okay, well, what's the excess in this market? Is there a 60,000 square foot excess of demand over supply for co-working space? And if so, okay, well, it seems like, building a 20,000 square foot co-working space seems like possibly a not such a risky proposition. Now, I mean, that, once again, that's just a very broad view of the market. But this was just a way for us to, like I said, figure out where to take a closer look. And then once you do that, then it's more about like site analysis and other things like that.
Right. And also about innovation centers and workforce development and economic development centers, along with, what I think of as sort of the neighborhood identity, the identity that makes up, that city or that location or the neighborhood within the city, whether it be downtown or a more outlying neighborhood from the downtown, and the personality that's within that particular location. Because if you try to apply the same factors from one market to the next, you're more likely to, I think, have an empty shell that houses people than you are that kind of co-working feeling that you walked into when you joined the co-working space in Georgia.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's, co-working more so than probably any other type of real estate, I believe, is like really about like connecting to like the local environment that you're in. And when we were, when I was planning on doing co-working development, one of our ideas was that in each space we wanted to incorporate like design and, whether it's like imagery and pictures or just like architecture or whatever, incorporate that all into the space, which I think is kind of a cool way to do it, and which I've seen in some of like Jeremy's next space locations in the Bay Area. But, like definitely when you are looking at more like neighborhood or, like neighborhood level of analysis, you're looking, some of these things are still important, like the population, the number of white collar workers, the number of Starbucks, that's all important. But it's also about like, you need to define like for each site, you kind of like define like a trade area and figure out like where are the people living that are going to be using your co-working space, and like where are they coming from and how are they driving there, and like what are the traffic patterns. I mean, you can get really detailed and sophisticated with the analysis if you want to, and we didn't really even get to that point, that level of analysis, and I think that in the past, like co-working has kind of been, you build a co-working space in the right market and it's probably going to fill up because there's so much demand for co-working right now. But I think that like, as more and more people open co-working spaces and the market becomes more saturated, this analysis is going to become more and more important, and like understanding exactly like where the demand is coming from, and understanding like the demographics and like all these little details about each market is going to become more and more important.
Yeah, and I'm curious how you would apply financial analysis to this, because I see that as another next step. Whereas in your first list, Austin and San Francisco might be, the most obvious choices. They're also going to be some of the most expensive in terms of real estate, especially San Francisco. And so determining viability based on that as well. In Santa Cruz, where I live, our real estate is really expensive, but the earning potential for the majority of the population is pretty low unless you commute what we call commute over the hill to the Silicon Valley, where the earning potential is exponentially higher. And so, determining whether or not just the sheer price per square foot of real estate allows for a co-working space to be profitable is another, I think, really important determination that people are going to have to look at.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, like, different markets, some are more expensive and some are less expensive in terms of real estate. And then usually that translates to higher prices for co-working memberships, but possibly not always. There might be markets that are expensive, but co-working hasn't really, the popularity of it hasn't spread to the extent that it has in other markets. And maybe that makes those markets really bad because it's high real estate prices and low membership prices. And then there's also, real estate's not the only expense in co-working. Some of the expenses are variable and kind of change with the market, but then some are fixed and don't really change that much regardless of what market you're in. So, so that would mean that for certain markets that have really low membership prices, and it would mean that the fixed costs probably take up a higher percentage of the revenue that's coming in. So, I mean, that's really, that's kind of like a whole nother analysis, which I would love to actually do one day. But that's something that you would probably want to do on just like kind of a city by city basis as you do it. And I don't know if that probably wouldn't be like my starting point if I'm looking at which markets to go into, because usually the real estate prices, if they're high, it's offset by higher membership prices. not always, but usually. So, if that's the case, then, markets should be comparable regardless of the price of the real estate.
Yep. Yeah. Well, Doug, this tool is wonderful, and thank you so much for sharing it.
No
Um,
problem.
if people want to get in touch with you to learn more about your methodology or potentially share ideas with you or learn
Mhm.
from you, how do they do that?
They can email me, Doug@meshworkapp.com.
Great. Thank you. And tell us what's next. What are you working on now? You mentioned that you thought you wanted to go into co-working next. So are you opening spaces? What are you doing? You found a software company? What's going on?
Well, yeah, I decided to start a software company. Yeah, we make software for co-working. It's really like an ecosystem for co-working spaces and members to connect and to collaborate, and it's a entire platform for co-working spaces to run their businesses and hopefully make them more profitable. And been working on that a while, and we should launch in our beta version in about 3 weeks. So pretty excited about that.
Wow. Well, I'm really excited to see it. And once you launch, we'll get you back over here and you can talk about what Meshwork app can do for co-working people.
Awesome. Thanks
Well,
a lot.
thanks so much for talking with me and sharing your super brainiac geeking out on numbers spreadsheet that you have there. Very much appreciated.
Definitely enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Doug. Well, thanks for tuning in today. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. And next week, I will be continuing my neighborhood co-working focus with talking with Maura Hauser from 25 North Co-working in Geneva, Illinois. Maura is creating a network of suburban co-working spaces to meet the needs of people working outside of urban cores who also need a place to work and a community of people to work in. See you next week at 10 a.m.